Thank you everyone for joining. We are discussing the impact of COVID-19 on anti-government and nationalist groups. Just a few things before we begin on the content of the presentation. One thing we wanted to let you know of is that the content of this lecture can be considered graphic for some. It includes information on violence, racism, and hate speech. So please keep that in mind if you are going to continue to watch. The presentation mainly considers activities of anti-government and white nationalist groups. It focuses on conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns. And please keep in mind that because COVID-19 events develop so rapidly, the information covered in any presentation on COVID-19 can quickly be outdated, even perhaps as soon as the next day. So for the purposes of this presentation, I've elected to focus on more strategic trends and causes. A couple of other notes on terminology. Coronavirus is a term used to describe a family of viruses. COVID-19 is the disease caused by the novel or new coronavirus. And the virus that causes COVID-19 has been named SARS-CoV-2. To save space for this presentation, you'll notice that I've abbreviated coronavirus or COVID to just COV, COV. And that's how I'll try to refer to it as much as possible. Let's start with the known global impacts of COVID-19. There are three main categories of the impacts. One is economic, one social, and one is political. Of course, there are health implications as well. We're not necessarily going to discuss for this presentation. And you may notice if you've watched previous presentations, these three categories are repeat. But a little bit drilled down into it. Economic, it includes some impacts on unemployment, obviously, shrinking GDPs, decreased trade and travel because of the different lockdowns and border closings. And obviously it highlights weaknesses of our supply chains. So those fall under economic impacts as a result of COVID-19. There are also social impacts. There are anti-migrant sentiments and movements. There are anti-Chinese or Far East Asian movements. And of course, there's always the blame and conspiracy theory games. And as far as political, it does have a specific highlight on the lack of preparedness for governments. And it has highlighted many threats to and weaknesses to our national security, both domestic and international threats. As we've discussed, some of these categories match quite well with known catalysts for extremist growth. So generally, insecurity, chaos, any type of uncertainty creates an environment where growth of any type of extremist ideology and then specific extremist movements are accelerated. So you will notice economic instability and uncertainty that can serve as one of the catalysts for growth of extremist movements. Social instability, which we're experiencing quite heavily right now. And then political or governance instability. And that's not necessarily to suggest that a government is collapsing, but when the citizens do not have enough faith in the government's response to any type of crisis, that does create instability. Briefly on the history of anti-government militias and groups or nationalist groups in the United States. This is quite a nice graphic done by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it kind of gives you an idea of how many anti-government or militia groups there have been since 1995, and it also gives you a nice representation of the timeline and the increases and the decreases that I face. So obviously you can see in the mid-1990s, going back to even 1990, there were quite a lot of anti-government movements popping up around the country. This is represented by things like the Waco incident. And then we see a little bit of a leveling off and decrease until the election of President Barack Obama. And then there was a surge again in anti-government and anti-government militia groups. And again, you see the representation, and it somewhat has started to decline. And this graphic in particular shows trends until 2019. Of course, as we'll learn in this presentation, there may in fact be an increase in anti-government militias and groups in 2020 as one of the byproducts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, on some of the historical trends from 2014 to 2019, there's a nice breakdown again by the Southern Poverty Law Center of militia groups and other types of patriot groups. And you do see that in 2018, there was an increase of militia groups. And it's kind of remained the same. It went from 35 identified groups to 31 in 2019, but very curious to see what 2020 figures will show. So we've established that anti-government and nationalist groups are nothing new in the United States and in fact in the world. What I want to discuss next is disinformation campaigns and in particular conspiracy theories that are being promoted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm not going to go into too far into detail about these, but I'm going to mention basically the themes that they espouse and what they surround. So the first one, COVID-19 or the coronavirus is a bioweapon. That has been a rather large disinformation campaign, and a lot of conspiracy theories are surrounding that. And, you know, it depends on where you are in the world, who you talk to, but it could be created by several different entities. Some say it was created by China. Some people say it was created by the United States. Some say Russia. There are entities out there that say it was a joint venture between Russia, or rather the United States and China. And related to the next one, coronavirus is created by either the ultra-rich, the deep state, Bill Gates, George Soros. And some of these conspiracy theories also state that whoever they espouse that created these viruses also has the cure, just saving it. And then there are a set of conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns saying that coronavirus was created to lock up citizens in order to impose martial law and or limit civil liberties. And then coronavirus created to interfere with the 2020 US presidential election that is being kicked around on the internet as well. There are sentiments being shared online by certain groups that coronavirus was or is still being caused by migrants. Another one is coronavirus caused by or linked to 5G technology. And we've seen this in the example of quite a few 5G towers being burnt by extremists in the United Kingdom. And then lastly, you know, there's the coronavirus is a complete hoax and there's actually no pandemic, and the government is just using the hoax as an excuse to do something. And as you can tell, these conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns do feed off of each other. They could be intermingled, or they could be related to one another. So just because they're listed on a different line doesn't mean that we look at them completely separately. As far as disinformation campaigns and conspiracy theories, they're mainly disseminated via 5 platforms or mediums. One obviously is social media platforms, you know, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Those are some of the more popular ones. There's some on Instagram, you name it, you know, the extremist groups and those who are trying to promote the propaganda will use that medium. There are online forums. 4chan is an example. 4chan does serve as quite a good propaganda machine because it's unmonitored, and you can basically post anything you want on there with some limitations. But it offers a certain amount of deep web privacy that other websites do not necessarily offer. There are also messaging apps that these groups do take advantage of. One specifically is called Telegram, and it's a direct one-on-one messaging app, but you can form groups on Telegram, and Telegram does offer certain privacy advantages. It's actually often used by reporters, journalists who want to maintain anonymity of their sources and can't necessarily track them. So Telegram has been one of those mediums that has served the purpose of anti-government groups. And then, of course, as we've come to realize, video games have tended to be a platform where a lot of propaganda and conspiracy theories are shared because a lot of video games have chat functions and forums, and where players can communicate with one another. And then, of course, conspiracy theories and more formalized disinformation campaigns are being spread by state-owned news outlets, mainly Iranian, Russian, and Chinese news. Briefly want to talk about relevant players and as far as nation states, anti-government groups, and then white nationalist groups. We'll talk more in depth as we go through the presentation, but I want to just briefly outline them so there's some kind of checklist that you can, if you choose to learn more about certain groups or movements, you can go back. Obviously, we mentioned nation states and in previous presentations as well, but China, Russia, Iran, three of the bigger players. And as far as disinformation campaigns. And then as far as anti-government groups and militias in the United States, there is a movement and somewhat of a group called the 3 Percenters. Now, I will say that there is no 100% unity within the groups that refer to themselves as 3 Percenters. There's 3 Percenter original, and then every state has a chapter, and cities may have chapters, and you don't get necessarily the same type of messaging from all of them, but generally speaking, they are an anti-government or anti-government watchdog type of organization, and they are considered a militia group. There's the Oath Keepers. There is there's a term or movement called sovereign citizens, which can encompass quite a lot of different groups. There's Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, American Revolution 2.0. These are some of the groups that have been named and had more activity throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, of course, there are white nationalist groups. Some are very easily identified and recognizable, like the National Socialist Movement. That's basically a neo-Nazi group. There are other white nationalist groups that you may hear of. One you may not have heard of as a movement. Again, loosely termed a group of organizations with like-minded ideology called the Boogaloo Movement. And it's, based on basically a philosophy that the end of times or some type of civil war will lead to the collapse of the United States, and the government and society can be recreated with white supremacist ideologies. Now, we're going to begin with nation states and non-state actors. Both state-sponsored media and extremist movements are exploiting the COVID-19 situation to spread harmful and hateful messaging on social media. Some of these conspiracy theories suggest that the governments, in fact, spread the viruses with the aim of limiting civil liberties. And this is a theme that will be repeated with a lot of these anti-government militias whose philosophy and foundation is basically to protect the citizenry from the government when civil liberties are being infringed upon. Another conspiracy theory suggests that basically an authoritarian form of government is a better system, better suited to respond to big catastrophic events such as this type of global pandemic. And This is mainly being pushed by nation states, obviously authoritarian ones like China, like Russia. And the argument is, look, the authoritarian system, as opposed to a democratic system, could move much more quickly to go into lockdowns, force people to stay inside their homes, rapidly go in with the military or state police and build hospitals, and then completely eradicate the pandemic. And of course, you know, there's debates on that. But Russia also claiming, even though they're not very upfront about sharing how many cases of coronavirus are in their country, they're saying that they're very low, and it's been controlled because of the system and how the Russian government operates. Trends, one of the big trends is a case being made for white supremacy. And as part of that, there's a lot of anti-Chinese ethnic disinformation being created. So as part of these types of activities, these groups have claimed with unverified videos of what they claim to be Chinese bulk buying emergency supplies. And they're suggesting that these people, whoever is being filmed at whatever time, it could be, you know, now or 10 years ago, suggesting that an attempt to limit emergency supplies for other countries. So, you know, there have been supposed videos popping up in the United States, Europe, from China, you know, unverified and unproven, unsubstantiated claims. And then there are unverified videos of Chinese, or what the narrators claim as Chinese, spitting on fresh produce in supermarkets, or wiping saliva on door handles, public benches, etc. So this suggests that there is a deliberate attempt to spread the virus by this particular ethnic group. So that's one of the white supremacist disinformation campaigns. Another one is, of course, the anti-Semitic disinformation campaign. So theories that suggest coronavirus was started by Jewish people to manipulate financial and economic markets. That's nothing new from white supremacists and white supremacist organizations or white nationalist organizations. And then theories that suggest coronavirus was started by Jewish people to kill white people with the aim of changing the demographics in North America, United States, and then in Europe as well. Again, nothing new, specifically, you know, new for this pandemic as far as white supremacist movements. The anti-Semitic disinformation campaigns have always been. And then there is the white supremacists making a case for anti-migrant movements and disinformation. So they suggest that the migrant routes in Greece and Turkey, and then Mexico and the United States border, will help serve as vectors for the transmission of the viruses. So they're saying we need to shut down all these borders altogether to limit the spread or stop the spread. And then there's a suggestion that immigrants and minorities will use the coronavirus to riot. We've seen a lot of this type of propaganda in European countries where they're trying to scare people, unsubstantiated again, with rumors that the immigrant communities or the minority communities are using this as an excuse or are going to start rioting. And then there are suggestions that asylum seekers in Europe are rioting against quarantine, and there have been even claims that they're flying the ISIS flag, specifically related to COVID-19. When it comes to combining the propaganda campaigns coming from white supremacist organizations, they're not just conspiracy theories or disinformation campaigns. There actually are calls for action. There are suggestions that white supremacists infected with the virus should themselves inflict violence, basically turning themselves into bioweapons and going and spreading their virus to others, particularly minority groups or their political enemies, as they refer to. And then US federal investigators have actually learned of white supremacists that plan to use coronavirus as a bioweapon against non-white people. They specifically, in certain papers, listed Jewish and Muslim communities and places of worship as targets. And then there are calls for followers to capitalize on pressures caused by the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic, onto our public services. So they're saying, hey, emergency services are less likely or less able to respond right now, so it's a good time to go after soft targets. And unfortunately, hospitals where coronavirus patients are being treated have been identified by extremist groups as one of those soft targets. These are some of the images that are being posted online on the different platforms. On the left, you see a coronavirus kind of graphic poster. And it may not be super clear, but it's basically a person in a limited hazmat suit covering their face, and there's a rifle in their hand. And then obviously on the right, there's a hazmat suit that they're wearing with a mask and a rifle. And different messages appear with these types of pictures, but basically these are calls for actions or calls to be prepared to take action. This post in particular actually comes from Telegram, and I'm not going to read it all, but you know, giving you time to read it. Basically, a racist diatribe of a person by the name of Timothy in one of the southern states that actually was shot by FBI agents because he was about to carry out an attack on a hospital where coronavirus patients were being treated. So this is basically someone, you know, not only reading into the disinformation campaigns, but actually responding to one of the calls for action. Democracy is a failure. That's another trend that we're seeing that's continuing through disinformation campaigns, and then again for calls for action. There's a movement rather called Acceleration-ism or Accelerationist-ists, which basically a movement that promotes the idea that democratic or democracy, democratic societies or democracies is a failure, and that groups should accelerate its end through mobilizing social conflict and violence. So we discussed the Boogaloo movement and those types of groups. This is particularly one of them, and this originally, I believe, started as anti-capitalist movement, basically saying that capitalism was going to lead to the collapse of civilization. But these people want to accelerate the fall of democracy and fall of society in order to be able to rebuild it. So this is a number of communities supporting white supremacist, accelerationist terror, or using the crisis as an opportunity to call for attacks, hoping to overwhelm emergency services and hasten societal collapse. So one note about them is that not all accelerationists are white supremacists, and that'll come into play a little bit. Timothy Wilson was the name of the person in Missouri who died after a shootout with the FBI. And he was suspected of plotting a domestic terror attack on a hospital, as we discussed. And I believe he was going to use explosives to carry that attack out. FBI officials stated that he was motivated by racist and anti-government belief. Wilson had previously considered attacking a school with a large number of Black students, a mosque, and a synagogue. So the FBI had actually been monitoring this person for a while, and that's one of the reasons why that Telegram message or several messages were released, because they had been watching them. This is another post online basically discussing the fact that the National Guard being called in, and again, this is somewhat of an accelerationist ideology that because civil liberties are being infringed upon or limited at least because of the lockdowns, because businesses are being closed, for social distancing reasons and to limit the spread, National Guard is being called in. They like this. They think, they refer to this as the storm that's brewing and coming. And this is like one of the first steps of societal collapse that they can take advantage of. And you can see this as a Twitter platform. There are other, graphics that I wanted to show. The one on the left is discussing goals. So contract the coronavirus and lick every doorknob in the local IRS office until the lights fade to black. So again, very much so anti-government, establishment sentiments. And on the right, again, I'm not going to read it word for word, but this is basically saying, hey, we told you this was going to happen. This is the storm that's coming. Again, this is on a rather not necessarily a popular platform, but it is being used by more and more, especially in extremist movements. One important thing, this is pictures of the rally or protest in Michigan that was organized to try to fight the lockdowns. If you notice, one of the themes that repeats with some of the protesters, if you notice on the left, the person on the left is wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and then the picture on the right, the two people on the right are wearing Hawaiian style shirts. The Boogaloo movement identifies themselves as somewhat of a uniform by wearing Hawaiian shirts. So if you see someone in rallies wearing that type of clothing, chances are they're part of the Boogaloo or Acceleration-ists movement. And then they did a very good job in not wearing insignia, but many of the militias that normally wear insignia were not at these rallies. But you may see at these rallies, people holding long guns, automatic rifles, and basically having military-style patches on their arms or even their chest to identify what groups they belong to. There have been windfall opportunities also as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And when you have a situation where there's a combination of lockdowns, conspiracy theory, disinformation campaigns, instability of social, economic, or political proportions, it leads to some other advantages. So one thing that has been reported that recruiting for these types of organizations has increased. One, obviously, there's way more propaganda and disinformation. And two, people have been stuck at home, so they have more time to be online, fall into certain traps online and keep going down the rabbit hole and read more and more about it. And one particular group that has been targeted is teenagers that are spending all their time online because schools were closed or canceled, and they're playing video games, they're on chat rooms, YouTube, Facebook, whatever it may be. Because of the same reasons, many of the same reasons, these organizations are able to do more fundraising right now. And then they also have the opportunity that they may not have had to test the system's response. So one example of a test is that armed militia members storming or trying to get in and to the Michigan State House, where normally you would not be allowed to enter at all if there was just one or two people. So obviously they were testing the system to see what the response would be, trying to see how far they could push. This is a picture from the same rally in Michigan as the other two pictures. Again, you see the same type of clothing. Some of these people could be part of these formalized militia groups, some not. Again, you see the same individual wearing the Hawaiian shirt on the right-hand screen there. So not all of these people, and there really are no figures to inform us, but not all of these people were people who were out of work that wanted to get back to work, or small business owners who just wanted to get back to work and believed that their business was essential. And then, of course, we come to more recent events on top of the COVID-19 pandemic of protests resulting after the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests. So in these circumstances specifically, some white supremacists have attended Black Lives Matter protest to counter protest, basically, and create some instability. Some Boogaloo groups, members have supported, in fact, the protests, because many Boogaloo members are primarily anti-government and anti-police rather than white supremacists. And then there are militia groups that have been hostile to the protesters, obviously. I don't think the 3%ers or the Oath Keepers had any love for the protesters. And then there are anarchists also that are taking advantage of the societal unrest, basically taking advantage of it. And, you know, some of them have the same goals as Acceleration-ists, which is basically wanting to accelerate the fall of the government. And then there are the loose collection of groups referred to often as Antifa. They've been reported to attend these events, in particular the Black Lives Matter protests. And you know, it's hard to single out a specific Antifa group because there are a collection of groups, but they like to challenge these other types of groups, and sometimes they do so violently. I briefly wanted to just state some of the resources that were used for this presentation. So there's the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, the Soufan Center, Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which we discussed, and of course the Anti-Defamation League. If you're interested in learning more about any of these topics, these organizations have quite a tremendous amount of information. And that brings us kind of to a conclusion. Try to keep it short and hopefully leave some time for questions if there are any.